In the last lecture, we had a high-level overview of how the web works and we understood the concept of client-server architecture. In this lecture, let's try to understand HTTP request and responses more closely. Basically, in this lecture, we are going to have a close look on how the HTTP request and response messages looks like. We talked about client-server architecture in our last lecture. There we learned that in order to access a website, from the client we make a request to the server and then the server sends back a response to the client. Basically here, the client and the server are communicating with each other. And in order to communicate with each other, the client and the server are using a protocol called as HTTP. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And HTTP is a protocol that defines a set of rules to send requests from the client to the server and receive responses from the server to the client. All the websites on the internet use HTTP protocol with or without SSL. We can also use HTTP using some encryption for security, then it is called as HTTPS. So HTTPS is basically HTTP with extra security provided by SSL or TLS. SSL stands for Secured Socket Layer and is used to provide secure HTTP connection between client and the server by encrypting the connection. HTTP protocol was developed by Tim Berners-Lee in 1990 and later it was standardized by IETF so that it can be used worldwide. So when we try to access the ASP.NET Core application using a browser, the browser sends an HTTP request to the server where the application is hosted. On this server, we have web servers like Kestrel, IIS, Apache, which is responsible for accepting and handling the request. In this example, we are using Kestrel web server. Now from the web server, the request is then passed to ASP.NET Core application for further processing. And this request is passed as an HTTP context object. And using this request, the ASP.NET Core application creates a response. Now ASP.NET Core application passes that response to the web server, and from the web server, the response is sent back to the client. So keep in mind that this HTTP context object, which the Kestrel is passing to ASP.NET Core application, it contains the request and the response. So here, the request which we are receiving on the server and the response which we are sending from the server, these are called as HTTP request and HTTP response because these request and response follows a set of rules defined by HTTP protocol. Basically, the data which is traveling between the client and the server that is using a set of rules which is defined by the HTTP protocol. Let's try to understand this with an example. Let's go to our ASP.NET Core application. And now when we run this application will be hosted on a server. In this case, it will be hosted on this Kestrel server. So whenever we make a request to this root URL, this Kestrel server will receive that request. And then it is going to send a response. So basically, this text will be sent in the response. Let's actually see that. Let's run this application. So here you can see we have received this response in the browser, in the client. So basically, this browser made a request to our ASP.NET Core application, and then the Kestrel server sent us this response. Now here what we can do is, we can inspect the request which we sent from the client. For that, you can click on these three dots. You can go to More Tools, and here we want to open the Developer Tools. Okay, so in this way, you can open the Developer tool in the browser. Or what you can also do is, you can right click and you can click on this Inspect. This will also open the Developer tool. Here, we want to go to this Network tab. And in this Network tab, we can see the requests which has been made from this browser. So if I refresh the page here, if I click on this reload button, what will happen is a new request will be sent to this URL. So that request will be displayed here. Let's actually see that. So if I reload the page, you can see that a request has been listed here. And the request has been made to localhost. Here you can also see other details like the status code of the request, type, initiator, etc. Now when you click on this request, it is going to open the details of that request. So here you can see the general information about that request. So basically, what was the request URL, what type of request we have made. Here we have made a GET request. So in the last lecture we learned that this GET is an HTTP method. It is a HTTP verb. Then We can also see the status code of the response. So it is 200 OK. So these are some general informations about the request and the response. If I close this, here you can see we have response headers. And then here we have the request headers. So in the last lecture, we also briefly talked about the request and response headers, right? So let's start with the request here. If I expand this, here you will see this button view source. Let's click on that. When you click on this view source button, it is going to show you the actual request message which was sent to the server. Let me move this developer tool a little bit up so that it will be more visible. Okay, so here you can see the request message. Now, in the last lecture, we learned that the first line of the request message is the start line. So this here is the start line. In the start line, we have the HTTP method which has been used to make the request. Here, we have made a GET request. Then here, we also have the target resource to which we have made the request. Here, we have made a request to root URL. So that's why the resource here is basically this single slash. But after this root URL, after this localhost colon 4200, if I type something like slash home, in that case, the target resource will be slash home. So here you will see slash home. If I say slash products, in that case, the target resource will be slash products. So in that case, here you will see slash products. Then this is the HTTP version which we are using in order to make the request. Then here we have some request headers. Now we will talk about request and response headers in the later lecture of this course. But after the start line, we have request headers. Then we should have request body. Now since we are making a GET request, with the GET request we don't send any body. So here we don't have any request body. But let's say if we are making a post request, put request, or patch request, in that case with the request we also need to send the body. So in that case the request message will also have a body. Also keep in mind that these request headers which you are seeing here, these are prepared by the browser before sending the request to the server. And as a backend developer, we can read these headers programmatically in our ASP.NET Core application. So as soon as the Kestrel server or any other server where we are hosting our ASP.NET Core application, as soon as it receives the request, it passes that request to the ASP.NET Core application with all these informations like request headers, request body, start line, etc. That means when we made a request to this root URL, to this localhost colon 4200, and if I open this request again, let's click on this view source. So basically, when we made the request to this localhost colon 4200 to the root URL, that request was received by the Kestrel server. And Kestrel server passed that request to the ASP.NET Core application in the form of HTTP context object. So all these informations which you are seeing here, that will be available on that HTTP context object. Let's actually see that. Let's go to our .NET Core application. And when we are making a GET request to this root URL, we are sending this text in the response. Basically, whenever a request is made to this root URL, this function is getting called. Okay. But this function can also receive a parameter of type HTTP context object. So here, let's pass that parameter to this method. And the parameter type is HTTP context. Let's specify a name here. Let's call it context. So basically, when we receive the request on the Kestrel server passes that request to this ASP.NET Core application using this HTTP context object. Okay. Now here we are going to use multiple lines of code inside this method. So I'm going to use a set of curly braces like this. Okay. Let's move it to a separate line. Let's also return this text from this method as a response. And here, let me stop this application first because we need to rebuild this application. So here we have not done any changes. The only change which we have done is that this function which we are passing to this map get, it is going to get this HTTP context object. Rest other things are same. Now this HTTP context object, it is going to have the request and response object. So on this context, we can access the request object. So here you can see we have the request object. And on that request object, we can access the URL to which the request was made, or the HTTP method which was used to make the request. All those informations we can access on this request object. So for example, let's say we want to get the path to which the request was made. We can use this path property of this request object. And let's go ahead and let's assign it to a variable. So this path is going to be of type string. So here, let me create a path variable, and to that, we are going to assign the request path. So now in the response, instead of sending this text, let's say we want to display the path to which the request was made. So here, let's say request path, and then let's append this path variable. And now let's go ahead and let's run this application. So you can see in the response, we are getting request path and then this single slash. So basically we are making a request to this root URL. So that's why the path is this single slash. In the same way, if we want to get the HTTP verb, the HTTP method which we have used to make this request, for that, let me stop the application. So for that, on this request object, we have another property called method. So let me copy this line. Let's paste it here. And here, we also want to know the HTTP method which was used to make the request. For that, we can use this method property. And let's call it as method. And here, let's again append some text. And we want to append the value stored in this method variable. All right. So basically, we want to log to which URL the request was made and what HTTP method was used to make the request. Let's go ahead and let's rerun this application. So now you can see request path is this root URL and HTTP method which was used is this get method. So basically, on this context object, you have this request object, and this request object contains all the information related to the request which has been made to the server. Okay, let's run this application again. And now let's go ahead and let's open the developer tool one more time. So let's go to this network tab and let's make a request to this localhost :4200. So basically, let's make a request to this root URL. For that, I'm going to click on this reload button. The request is made. Let's click on this request. So here we have already seen the request message. Now let's see the response message. Again, in order to see the actual response message, you can click on this view source. Okay, so this is the response message. And we again saw this response message in our last lecture. So basically, a response message also has the start line, and this start line consists of HTTP version which we are using, the status code, and the status message. The status code and status message is used to tell the client what has happened with the request, whether the request was successful or not, or whether the resource which we requested that was found or not, or some error happened. Okay, so this status code and status message tells what has happened with the request. Then we have the response headers. Again, we will talk about these response headers in great detail in one of the future lectures of this section. And then we should have the response body. Now, if you want to see the response body, you can go to this response section, and there you can see the response body. Okay. Now, ASP.NET Core application prepares the response, and then it handovers that response to the Kestrel server in the form of HTTP context object. And then the Kestrel server sends that response back to the client. So here, if we go back to our ASP.NET Core application, there on this context object, we should also have a response object. Just like we have this request object, we should also have a response object on this context object. So on this context, we can access the response object. And on this response object, we have other properties. For example, this content type, status code, etc. So here, let's try to set the status code. Okay, and let's set the status code to maybe 404. Okay, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, the response is something which can be set by the backend developer. So we as a backend developer is responsible for how the response will look like. We don't have a control over how the request will look like, but we do have a control over how the response will look like. So we as a backend developer are going to prepare the HTTP response. Alright, so here I'm setting the status code as 404. So now when we make a request to this URL, let's do the hot reload here. Let's go back to the browser and there let's make a request again. And now you will see that the status code of that request is 404. Okay, so in this way, here we are creating the response and then we are handing back this response to the Kestrel server, and then the Kestrel server sends that response back to the client. All right, let's change the status code back to 200. Let's do the hot reload here. Let's go back to the browser and let's refresh the page. So this time the status code should be 200. So now when we are making the request, the status code is 200. All right, so here we had a closer look on the request and the response messages in this lecture. In the next lecture, let's talk about some important status codes and their meaning and when to use which status code. And then we will talk about request and response headers. This is all from this lecture. Thank you for listening and have a great day.